But the ones that did believe, they've been reading what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls now, but they've been reading these scrolls, they've been learning this stuff their entire lives. And in there are specific prophecies about what to expect when the Messiah comes, even to the year of when he would arrive. So they knew, they've studied this their whole lives, they knew the Messiah is going to arrive in my lifetime. And then once Jesus came on the scenes and then started fulfilling some of this stuff, they just immediately caught it. And so I think all of these things kind of added together. Plus, there's just kind of an air of mystery around it, being the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think all of that put together really piques people's interest. Another thing, and this isn't such a good thing, but another thing too is there are extremists that will take the Dead Sea Scrolls and say that they say just the absolute wildest things. I mean, I remember you're talking about the 90s. I remember I was actually a kid in the 90s, and I would go to the supermarket with my mom, and I would see these tabloids. The Dead Sea Scrolls predict Jesus is coming back this year, and like just all this insane stuff, and it doesn't say anything like that. So I think that initial boom in the 90s, just getting all of this other stuff kind of in pop culture like that, because tabloids were a really big deal back then. Not so much anymore, thank God, but we got the internet now. So but I think all of that kind of rolled together adds to why these documents, more than almost anything else, why they're so interesting to people, and why they kind of have that pull on people.
Yeah, there's definitely a mystique, because I mean, I know for me, we have the biblical text, which is all there, and we can study it at any time. And then, but to be intrigued by, let's say, within you have what are known as apocryphal texts, like the Book of Maccabees and other things. But then you also have the pseudepigrapha, which are, you have Jewish pseudepigrapha and then even Christian. But to think in terms of like, the Testament of Adam and Eve, or the Testament of Abraham, you think, there's another story about Adam and Eve that I've never heard. I mean, besides, the first few chapters of Genesis. So it's very intriguing. But so there's no doubt that, as we said, there's 900 scrolls, and not all of them are biblical. Some are, again, even our commentaries. But some of the other things, you do have these other books that were well known at the time, again, like the Book of Enoch, where the average Jewish person living in the land, they were not illiterate.
Right.
They definitely, these books were well known. It's like, the Lord of the Rings or whatever, in the sense of you had books that are out there. And obviously, no doubt, this group down there at the Dead Sea, they made whatever their goal was. It wasn't just them. I think there were others that came and brought scrolls from a variety of places, brought them to this area to hide them away from the Romans, because we know that, again, the war of basically 66 AD to 70, they sought to hide these very important documents. Some of them biblical, others just other rules. But there is this fascination because, and we're going to get into some of the details there, but even by themselves, they provide great context for the Bible.
Yes.
They provide an understanding of the Essenes that were written by Josephus or others. I think additionally, which one of the main verses, and I know you know this, but is Isaiah 40 verse 3, prepare the way of the Lord from the wilderness, from the desert. And so we know John the Baptist, the New Testament clearly says that he fulfilled that from the book of Malachi and Isaiah as well. And so the question then comes, and this is just maybe, I'm curious your opinion on it. There are those scholars on both sides that I see. Was John the Baptist, his theme verse was Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3. Well, that seems to be the exact same theme verses of the Essenes. Yes. That's why they were in the desert. Yeah. So, was John the Baptist an Essene?
I believe so. I believe it's very highly likely. I'm not going to say for absolute sure because we weren't there, and new evidence could come out that could disprove that. But no, I think it's extremely likely that he was, because, like you mentioned, one of their biggest reasons for going into Qumran. I mean, there was a lot of political stuff going on at the time that they wanted to remove themselves from. And
we know there were scenes in every community, but there was this group down in the desert. I mean, no doubt.
Yeah, and those were the Zadokian priests, the priests that were from the line of Zadok, the way that God commanded it to be. And Israel started going away from that and started having priests that were not from that line. And there was a lot of other things too. They were having problems with the calendar because they had an invading force that wanted that wanted Israel to use their pagan lunar calendar. And some of Israel was like, okay, yeah, we'll do that so we can do our other Jewish things. And then other Jewish people were like, nope, absolutely, we're not doing that. We're leaving. And those were the Zadokian priests and the people that worked with the priests. And then those who followed their interpretation, which they maintained was the original Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament, those that followed that were just known as Essenes. So yeah, you do have that split. And another interesting difference too was, so the Pharisees got to the point where they just believed that prophecy had ceased because they weren't getting any prophecy from God anymore. Now, clearly, they adopted a pagan calendar. They weren't doing their temple rituals on the right days anymore, which there's very harsh consequences for that are laid out in the Old Testament. But the priests, the Qumran community is probably a better word for it, but the Qumran community fully believed in prophecy. They still had prophets. So going back to the question, was John the Baptist an Essene? One of the main prophecies that the Qumran community believed that they were fulfilling was that in Isaiah, that they were going to be the ones to prepare the way for the Lord. They even called themselves the way, which we get that from Acts. And when Paul is talking about there's this sect called the Way, that's Qumran. That's them. They called themselves the Way. What's really interesting too is they didn't call their area Qumran. They actually called it Damascus. There's a whole etymology, behind that. But that this goes a little bit outside of the question. But that caused me to wonder in the book, and I write a lot about it in the book. When Paul was in Damascus, which Damascus was it? Was it Syria or was it Qumran? Because we read that Paul had to get like special permission from the high priest to be able to go to Damascus and basically take care of business. Well, if it was Syria, would he need that? It makes more sense if it was actually Qumran and specifically, and I don't remember the exact verse, but I think it says somewhere in there that when he was lowered out of the window, that doesn't it say that he was on a street that was called the Way or something like that?
The street called Straight.
Straight, yeah, and make straight the way of the Lord. So it makes sense if that prophecy was so ingrained into who they were as a people. Of course, they're going to name their street stuff like that, So there's that. Also, we know that. Originally, John the Baptist's father would have been a Pharisee. He was in the course of Abiah, so he would have worked in the temple. John the Baptist clearly was not a Pharisee. Well, what happened? We are kind of told the story where his father sees this angel and he can't talk for a while. I think what happened, the Qumran community, the Zadokian priests, they were known for almost like apprenticeships. They were known for taking in children that parents wanted them to go study with the priest. They would take in children into their community and bring them up in the way of the Zadokian priesthood, or just the Qumran way, the Essene way. Well, it makes sense then after that experience with, we're not told this specifically, but it lines up that after John's father went through all that maybe he said, okay, well, I don't want my son John to be raised in the Pharisee in the temple way because that's clearly wrong. So let's send him out to the priests of Zadok and have him learn there. So so there's that. When we're introduced to John, he's doing baptisms. The way he was doing baptisms was very Essene. It's laid out in a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls how important ritual cleansings like that were, and they were a little different than the way that the Pharisees did it. The Pharisees they didn't necessarily like dunk the way that John the Baptist was doing. They had if I remember right, they had a really large, basically pool that they would walk into and fully submerge. And
walk on the right and come back up on the left.
Yeah. So it was a different process than how John the Baptist was doing it. So John the Baptist was not baptizing in the Pharisee way, but when you look at how the Essenes would do it, that lines up. So he didn't invent baptisms or anything, but what he was doing was he was baptizing people into this new faith because the Messiah was coming. And so John the Baptist was a literal fulfillment of that prophecy. He was making straight the way and all that. Another weird one. So all of that's pretty normal, but there's one weird one that I've always wondered since I was a kid. Why did did the writer feel it necessary to include that John was eating locusts?
Locusts and honey. Yes,
Yeah, like
yes.
why is that? That makes him sound like a crazy person to us because we're American and we don't do that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's something really interesting history behind that. It wasn't a typical delicacy to eat locusts in all of Israel, but in Qumran it was, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls there's actual provisions for how to prepare them. And so that's another thing that lines up as well. That was a delicacy unique to the Qumran community. There's not necessarily one smoking gun, but when you add all of these things together, and there's a few other things too, but when you add all of them together, it really seems like John the Baptist was in Essene. I mean, even just in his theology, what he was teaching, it's very Essene-esque. Like it lines up more with that than anything else. So yeah, I think it's extremely likely that John the Baptist was in Essene.